Iran just told its citizens to turn off their lights, not as metaphor, as policy, that tells you everything you need to know about where this is headed. The public narrative around Iran right now is built around familiar frameworks: sanctions, proxy conflict, nuclear brinkmanship. The Western press is largely presenting this as another chapter in a long-running geopolitical standoff, one that has always managed to find some equilibrium before reaching a true breaking point. That framing is dangerously incomplete. What is actually unfolding in the Persian Gulf right now is not a continuation of the prior pattern. It is the systematic destruction of the strategic architecture Iran spent for decades constructing, and it is happening faster than most serious analysts predicted, including those inside the regime itself. To understand what is really happening, you have to start not with April 2026, but with the foundational assumption upon which the Islamic Republic built its entire foreign policy posture. That assumption was simple, and for a long time it was correct. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point. Through that corridor, the International Energy Agency has documented the daily passage of roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products, representing approximately one-fifth of all seaborne oil supply moving anywhere on the planet. China draws a third of its total oil imports through that strait. Japan and South Korea are critically dependent on it. Europe receives a substantial portion of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar through those same waters. For decades, Iranian strategic planners looked at those numbers and concluded they held a veto over the global economy, not through military supremacy, not through conventional deterrence, through geography and the credible threat of disruption. This is what military theorists call asymmetric leverage, the ability of a weaker power to impose disproportionate costs on stronger adversaries by threatening something the adversary cannot easily replace or reroute. Iran's entire strategic identity was constructed around that leverage. It was the foundation beneath everything else: the proxy networks, the nuclear ambiguity, the regional power projection. All of it rested on the assumption that the world could not afford to call the bluff. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel called it. Coordinated strikes were launched against Iranian targets, and Iran responded precisely as it had always threatened to respond. It closed the strait. Shipping traffic collapsed by more than 70% in the initial days. An IRG senior official formally announced the closure on March 2nd. Iranian forces began mining the passage and boarding merchant vessels. Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel. European central banks froze rate decisions. Economists began seriously modeling a global recession scenario. For a brief window, it appeared the threat was working exactly as designed. The world was feeling the pain. But here is where the analysis has to become more precise, because there is a fundamental difference in strategic terms between a threat that has never been executed and one that has. The moment Iran physically closed the strait, it crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. It converted a deterrent into a demonstrated action, and, in doing so, it triggered a set of responses that its own strategic planners had modeled inadequately, because those planners had built their threat calculus on a world that had never seriously invested in alternatives. They were not accounting for the world that had actually been built while Iran was making its threats. The critical infrastructure investment that undermined Iran's leverage did not happen overnight. The Wais-Habshan to Fujairah pipeline, running 380 kilometers from the Abu Dhabi interior to a terminal on the Gulf of Oman, entirely bypassing Hormuz, had been operational for years. Saudi Arabia had expanded its east-west pipeline capacity with similar strategic logic. Qatar had been quietly diversifying its LNG routing. What looked to Iranian planners like an unchanging geographic choke point was actually a dependency that major energy producers and consumers had been systematically reducing for more than a decade. When the strait actually closed, the expected economic catastrophe was severe but not unmanageable in the way Iran had counted on. The world had quietly built the infrastructure to absorb it. Then came the move that restructured the entire equation. On April 13, 2026, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports. The strategic logic here is worth examining carefully, because this is not simply a naval operation. It is a precision economic siege designed to work in concert with Iran's own action against the strait, creating what analysts accurately began calling a dual blockade. Iran was denying the world's oil exports passage through the strait, while simultaneously the United States Navy was denying Iran's own oil exports any route to market through any other corridor. The result was a trap with no evident exit: Iranian crude. and condensate loadings, which had been running at approximately 2.1 million barrels per day in the first 2 weeks of April, collapsed after April 13th to roughly 567,000 barrels per day in the 10 days between April 14th and April 23rd, tracking data cited by commodity analytics firm Claypoler documented. Only 5 export cargoes actually departing Iranian terminals. That is not a slowdown, that is near total cessation. The consequences of that cessation are not simply financial in the immediate sense. They are infrastructural in a way that carries permanent implications, and this is the dimension that deserves the most serious attention. Oil that cannot be exported does not simply stay in the ground. It moves into storage, Iran's primary oil export. Terminal at Karg Island, which handles approximately 90% of the country's crude exports, was filling at an alarming rate. Analysis from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy documented that Iranian oil stocks increased by more than 6 million barrels in the 8 days between April 13th and April 21st alone. By April 20th, storage tanks at Karg were approximately 74% full. The operational threshold that petroleum engineers use as a practical ceiling is 80%, above which safety margins compress and operational flexibility disappears. Claypoler analysts estimated Iran was between 12 and 22 days from exhausting usable storage capacity. The Columbia Center's independent assessments placed similar timelines in their published work. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Ritter did not frame this diplomatically. He posted publicly on April 22 that Karg Island storage would be full within days, that Iran would be forced to reduce production, and that the consequence would be approximately $170 million per day in additional lost revenue alongside what he specifically described as permanent damage to Iran's oil infrastructure. The word permanent is doing critical work in that sentence. This is not rhetoric. This is a precise description of petroleum engineering reality. When oil wells are shut and under pressure, particularly in aging fields like those comprising much of Iran's production base, the reservoir dynamics change in ways that are not always recoverable. The pressure gradients shift, water intrusion accelerates in some formations. Antoine Haff, co-founder and chief analyst at Kairos, who has spent his career analyzing energy supply chains, explained to multiple outlets that the estimated permanent production loss from prolonged shut-in of Iranian fields runs between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. This is not lost revenue for this quarter. This is lost capacity for the remainder of the field's productive life. A blockade that achieves that outcome does not merely wound an economy, it structurally amputates a portion of it. The mechanism that makes this blockade qualitatively different from the sanctions regimes of the prior decade is worth explaining in detail because the operational comparison matters. For years, Iran evaded Western sanctions through a well-documented set of techniques. Ships would switch flags, they would turn off their automatic identification system transponders, the AIS beacons that normally broadcast a vessel's position and identification. They would conduct ship-to-ship transfers in obscure anchorages, transfer cargo through intermediary ports in jurisdictions that cooperated with Iranian commerce, and effectively disappear into the complexity of global maritime trade. That evasion architecture worked because monitoring it required resources and political will that were inconsistently applied. It does not work now. The U.S. naval presence in the region is operating with Sentinel-2 satellite imagery, a WACS surveillance aircraft, and the full intelligence collection architecture of U.S. Central Command. Transponder darkness is not concealment from a surveillance system operating at that level of capability. Ships are tracked by hull profile, thermal signature, and voyage pattern regardless of whether they are broadcasting. CENTCOM has confirmed that at least 39 vessels were redirected since the blockade began. 3 ships, the MV Tuska, the MT Tefani, and the MT Majestic X, were seized outright and remain in US custody. On April 28, Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit fast-roped onto the Comoros-flagged MV Blue Star 3 in the Gulf of Oman, conducted a thorough search, and released it only after verifying it was not bound for an Iranian terminal. The message delivered by that operation was unmistakable to every ship owner and charter operator in the region. This brings us to Chabahar, which deserves particular attention because it was explicitly designed as Iran's answer to a Hormuz blockade. The port sits on the Gulf of Oman, entirely outside the strait, and Iran spent years and substantial diplomatic capital developing it as an alternative export hub precisely for the contingency now unfolding. India invested in Chabahar development as part of a broader connectivity strategy. It was incorporated into the International North-South Transport Corridor framework backed by China and Russia. Iran marketed Chabahar as the strategic insurance policy that made the Hormuz threat less vulnerable to countermeasures. Today, more than 20 tankers and cargo vessels are crowded and waiting at Chabahar, loaded and unable to move because the U.S. naval blockade extends into the Gulf of Oman through exactly the waters those vessels would need to traverse to reach any meaningful market. 6 Iranian tankers laden with crude are documented by satellite imagery, loitering in a cluster near the port, sitting inside the U.S. blockade perimeter with no viable route forward. And then India, calculating its own strategic interests with the cold precision that has always characterized Indian foreign policy when real stakes are involved, quietly shelved its Chabahar investment and signed a new commercial agreement with the Way's Fujairah terminal. The partner Iran counted on to keep its alternative route viable chose the side that controls the water. The Way's own decision announced on April 28 represents one of the most consequential institutional acts in the Gulf's recent history, and it is not receiving the analytical depth it deserves. The United Arab Emirates, an OPEC member since 1967, nearly 6 decades of continuous participation in the cartel's coordination framework, announced its withdrawal from OPEC and the broader OPEC Plus alliance effective May 1, 2026. The timing was deliberate and the reasoning, as stated by Way Energy Minister Suhail Al-Mazrouai to CNN, was strategically precise. The strait closure would dampen the immediate market impact of the announcement, giving the Way the ability to position itself for a post-conflict energy architecture without triggering maximum immediate disruption. Read that statement carefully. Abu Dhabi is not reacting to the crisis, it is planning through it and beyond it. With OPEC quotas removed, the Way can move toward its stated target of 5 million barrels per day in production by 2027 with no coordination obligations to any other producer, including Iran, and critically, Way Oil already has a route to market that bypasses the strait entirely. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline's export volumes surged 57% from March 2026 onward as global buyers sought alternative supply with confidence that Way exports could actually be delivered. OPEC's share of global supply control has already fallen from approximately 30% to 26% as a direct consequence of this conflict's disruptions and realignments. The strategic implication for Iran is compounding. Elevated oil prices were one of the few remaining buffers for whatever shadow export revenue Iran could still generate through illicit channels, a Way that is unconstrained by production quotas and actively seeking to maximize market share is a structural force pushing prices downward. Iran is simultaneously losing export volume through the blockade and facing potential erosion of the per-barrel price on whatever it can still move clandestinely. That combination is not a financial problem, it is an existential economic trajectory. The most remarkable intelligence that has emerged from this entire crisis does not come from us Navy operational reporting or commodity tracking firms. It comes from inside the Iranian regime itself. On approximately April 27, 2026, Iran's Supreme National Security Council convened an emergency session chaired by Secretary Mohammad Baker Kalibaf, according to sourcing by Iran International, whose reporting on this meeting was subsequently picked up across global press. The security agencies presenting assessments at that meeting did not offer contingency planning or strategic alternatives. They presented what sources described as a highly critical picture of the regime's situation. 3 core conclusions were documented. First, that protests could break out within days. Second, that the regime could sustain the current conditions for at most 6 to 8 weeks before losing control of the domestic situation. Third, that by the end of spring, the private sector could shed approximately 2 million jobs, with particular concentration in oil-dependent industries, petrochemicals, and steel, which had already seen its export operations halted entirely, with recovery from infrastructure strikes expected to take years. The security agencies also noted that a 60-day internet shutdown, which had already been in effect, had effectively eliminated income for roughly 20% of the workforce dependent on connectivity-based employment. Banks, exchanges, and currency markets were largely frozen. The assessment concluded, and this specific language was reported by multiple outlets citing the same sourcing, that renewed protests are inevitable, not probable, not likely under certain conditions, inevitable. The only variable in the assessment of Iran's own security apparatus was the timing. That conclusion needs to be understood in its full weight. This is not an outside intelligence assessment of Iran's vulnerabilities. This is the regime's own Security Council putting in formal writing that the social contract holding the Islamic Republic together is approaching a breaking point and that the institution itself is losing confidence in its ability to prevent what comes next. The World Bank had projected before the war began in October 2025 that Iran's economy would contract in both 2025 and 2026, with annual inflation moving towards 60%. Iran's currency had already lost half its value between mid-2024 and early 2025 before any of the current military operations began. Food price inflation had exceeded 70%. Protests had already swept all 31 of Iran's provinces in late 2025, driven by domestic economic deterioration entirely independent of external military pressure. The blockade and the war are not creating Iran's crisis. They are accelerating and intensifying a trajectory that was already underway. What the Sensk meeting documents is the point at which even the regime's own analytical apparatus can no longer maintain the fiction that management is possible. The Iran that is now navigating this crisis built its strategic identity on a specific mythology, the fortress economy concept, the idea that the Islamic Republic had constructed sufficient self-reliance and leverage to absorb any external pressure indefinitely. That mythology served important internal political functions. It justified the costs of sanctions, the isolation, the economic mismanagement, the diversion of resources to proxy networks and military programs. The argument was always that the sacrifice was worth it because the fortress could not be broken. What April 2026 has demonstrated is that the fortress was built on a single load-bearing pillar. Control of Hormuz as an irreplaceable choke point, and that pillar has been effectively neutralized by a combination of infrastructure investment in bypass routes, naval blockade technology that has surpassed the evasion techniques Iran relied on, partner defection from India to the way, and a U.S. administration willing to use the full weight of its naval and economic tools simultaneously rather than incrementally. The strategic situation Iran now faces presents three trajectories, none of them acceptable to the hardline faction that has defined the regime's posture. The first is a negotiated exit requiring genuine nuclear concessions, verifiable IAEA access, and a lifting of the blockade in exchange for terms the Erdogan Supreme Leader's office would experience as a fundamental defeat, one that would restructure internal political power in ways that threaten the institutional interests of the factions who have most benefited from the confrontational posture. The second trajectory is a continuation of the blockade until domestic unrest crosses the threshold the regime's own the Security Council has identified as inevitable, at which point the regime faces the possibility of a repeat of 2009 or 1979, but in economic conditions far worse than either of those events unfolded against. The third is US military escalation that removes the decision from Iranian hands entirely. President Trump has already dismissed Iran's negotiating position when talks in Islamabad produced no substantive movement. The American delegation departed without a deal and strikes were subsequently authorized to resume. The pattern that is developing is one in which Iran's diplomatic offers have not matched the severity of its strategic situation. And the gap between what Iran is willing to concede and what the current pressure is extracting from it is not narrowing fast enough to find equilibrium before the domestic timeline runs out. History offers instructive parallels here, though none are exact. The siege of strategic economic assets as a tool of regime pressure has a mixed record. Iraq under sanctions adapted, corrupted the oil for food mechanism, and survived for over a decade before direct military intervention. The Soviet Union collapsed not from external military pressure but from the internal contradictions of an economy that could no longer sustain its ideological commitments. What makes Iran's situation distinct is the compression of timelines. The 6 to 8 week assessment from the Sensk is not a prediction of slow institutional decay, it is a countdown to a specific threshold of domestic uncontrollability, and unlike the Soviet case, Iran's collapse vector is not ideological exhaustion spread across decades. It is an oil storage tank filling toward 80% capacity on a day-by-day basis, an energy infrastructure sustaining accelerating production losses, and a workforce watching its purchasing power and employment dissolve in real time. What matters most about this moment is not the tactical military picture, though that picture is severe. What matters is that the assumptions underlying Iran's strategic posture for 47 years have been invalidated in a period of weeks, not by the superiority of opposing military force in the conventional sense, but by the culmination of years of quiet strategic preparation by Iran's adversaries. Pipelines were built, blockade technology was developed, partnership agreements were shifted, and when the moment came to act, the infrastructure to contain Iran's leverage was already in place. The mythology did not die in a spectacular military defeat, it is dying in spreadsheets of storage capacity and barrel per day calculations and a Security Council document that uses the word inevitable to describe what happens to its own streets. The regime that built its identity on the claim that it could never be broken is now governing by candlelight.